Some of you know that in the other part of my life, I do a thing called interplay, and I developed it with a colleague, Cynthia Whitten-Henry, about 24 years ago. And it started out just the two of us leading, but we would often be in situations where we would be leading in places where people were coming to us from other cities, other states, like at a conference or something. And then some of these people decided, well, I don't want to have to come to California every time I want to do interplay. I want to teach interplay in my own area, so that I'll have a community in my own home. And so we started to train people. And other cities started to develop where there was leadership for interplay. And those people started to lead others, and also to train them to lead as well. Now, an interesting thing has happened in some of those areas as that group of people, those first group of people who were trained as leaders, have started to step back from leadership. So Tom and Ginny in Raleigh, North Carolina, for example, a couple of years ago decided that they didn't want to lead as much, and so they stepped back in the Raleigh community. And the interesting dynamic that existed was that even though in their area they had a certain amount of authority because they were kind of the first ones to carry the magic word of Phil and Cynthia to North Carolina, they had a certain authority, and they trained a bunch of other people. As they stepped back, there were a group of people who, if you look at something from a hierarchical point of view, were kind of at the same level. They had been trained at the same time. There wasn't one particular person who had a position of authority by being the first or being the designated or whatever. And Cynthia and I don't do that. We don't kind of anoint people. We wait to see who emerges. But sometimes they don't emerge. And so these people who are kind of working together as colleagues and as equals are trying to figure out how the heck they're going to make things happen in their areas, and every region is different. And every once in a while, we get news from the regions about this thing happening or that thing happening, and we just kind of stand back and sigh. Okay, it's not really the same as this situation in the Bible, but it's not really too much different. So Paul had been traveling around, spreading the word of Jesus. And he had taken the word of Jesus to Corinth, and a bunch of people had been converted. A bunch of people were being saved. And then he would go on to another city, leaving those people to establish their own communities, to figure out how they were going to make things happen. But as you know, sometimes leadership is confusing, like who's in charge, who's got the authority, who can tell me what to do? Who am I willing to follow because I trust them, or I respect them, or I think somehow they have the word? And Corinth, oh, those poor Corinthians, they were having a hard time of it. And so Paul started getting these rumors back at the home office, and he was hearing that, some people not only were kind of confused about who was in charge, but they were saying, well, really, I'm a follower of Apollos, or I'm a follower of this person or that person, forgetting who they were really following. And so in this book of Corinthians, we find a lot of advice that Paul is giving the people of Corinth about who to follow. And of course, what's his primary piece of advice? Who are they really supposed to be following? Jesus. It goes back to the root. It goes back to that basic wisdom. It goes back to that primary person, that primary leader, that primary, it isn't even so much a person as a way of being, as a way of thinking about things, as a way. It's a way. Not just a person, but it's a way. And he called the people back to these basic ideas, these basic principles. And the truth of that is that when we reach back into the roots of what we believe, what we think is important, then the questions about following and leading are not as complicated. Now you can sort of see this, and quite frankly, I think there's quite a bit of this in our own DNA. You can't blame it all on the penguins. But there's a certain part of us that says, it's when someone says, especially someone who might be attractive or inspiring, It says, okay, everybody into the water. It's like, okay, there we go. We're lining up and we're jostling and we're pushing and we're ready to leap. It doesn't matter how cold the water is or how slippery the ice is or whether someone's stepping on my back flipper or whatever. We're ready to go. I think the truth about following and leading is that actually it's complicated or it's intertwined. There is no leading that does not include following. There is no following that does not include leading. So actually, perhaps what was happening in Corinth at that time is that they were trying to sort out, how do we follow and how do we lead? If you're going to be a follower of Jesus, actually that requires a certain amount of your own leading. I mean, first of all, Jesus isn't around, at least in the physical sense. Certainly around in a lot of other ways, and not very far away in terms of tapping into that wisdom. The other thing is that Jesus was living in a particular time, and he talked about the situations of that time, and some of those we can generalize to our time, but some are different. And so we have to figure out, we have to sort out, looking back at what's important, looking back at our basic understandings, our basic beliefs, to figure out how to move forward. So that takes a certain amount of discerning, and discerning is a leadership process. And there are times when actually people around us are going to be looking to us to help figure out the way. That there are times in our lives, actually quite often, where we're looking around in the landscape to figure out who are we going to follow. So it's interesting, over the last couple of weeks, I've been noticing, well, who do I want to follow around the issues in Syria? Who do I want to follow? It's a complex situation. I'm not sure I know everything in order to make a good decision. Do I follow the president? I have a lot of respect for him. Do I follow Jimmy Carter, who I have a lot of respect for, who's basically opposed to any military strikes? Do I follow Jim Wallace from the Sojourners community, who is really calling us to moral outrage, but not more violence? Do I follow one of the ethicists from Andover Newton, who wrote a really interesting paper looking at very carefully at the ethical underpinnings of the idea of just war and whether this situation satisfies those requirements, and coming to the conclusion, no, don't? Do I simply follow Jesus? And even that question isn't so easy, because this is a huge kind of geopolitical thing going on. And whether it's enough just to root ourselves in love and compassion and not pay attention to questions of power and the abuse of power, whether it's someone else or us. And yet I do feel called to come back to those roots, to come back to the idea that my own response needs to be one that's filled with compassion, which includes trying to understand the other. And frankly, in the Syrian situation, I kind of feel like all of those people are others in some way or another. How much do I know about those people, that culture, their way of being, what they want, what they need? I do know very clearly, though, that there are hundreds of thousands of refugees who have been affected by this, and that the response is inadequate to those people. And that is one of the things that I can do. That is one of the things that we can do. And I'm choosing to follow the leaders of the United Church of Christ who are calling us to contribute to those efforts. And you can do that. If you want to make a contribution this morning, you can just write Syria on your check. I'm going to put a link on the website so that you could click on that. At the very least, I know that I can respond with care and compassion. And I can continue to keep my mind open, to listen to what I truly believe I think is most important and what I think works in the world. Is violence ever a cure for violence, even in the face of great injustice? So the people in Corinth, I'm sure they got that letter from Paul. They sat down immediately and they got it all worked out. Because that's just the way it works in the world, right? One would hope. But if nothing else, Paul's wisdom calling us back to what's most important, our most basic beliefs. What is it that we profess? What is it that we believe? What is it that we root ourselves in? Especially when other forces, other ideas, other values are buffeting us. So let's have the courage when we realize that our following and leading may not quite be in line, that we can take a step back. We can root ourselves in what is most important. Amen.